Hello and welcome to my video all about how to knit a giant cable infinity scarf. For this project I used some super chunky acrylic yarn in a mustard colour and I used no more than 1.5 100-gram balls of yarn. The fact that I'm using super chunky yarn means that the scarf knits up pretty quickly and it's also really cosy. As recommended by the yarn label, I used some 10mm straight needles. The first step is to cast on 24 stitches, and I'm going to use my usual long tail casting on method to do this. If you did want to change the width of the scarf to make it wider or narrower, you would need to amend the pattern a little bit. Out of these 24 stitches, the first and last 3 stitches are going to be the border, and the central 18 stitches are going to be the cable. The pattern repeat is a 16-row pattern repeat, which might sound a bit daunting, but actually is very simple, especially because most of the rows are knit and purl rows that are repeated over and over. Okay, so row number 1 is a right side row, and we begin with 2 knit stitches. Remember throughout that when you're doing a knit stitch, the working yarn is at the back behind the needles, and when you're doing a purl stitch, the working yarn is at the front towards you. You then need to do a purl stitch. So bring the yarn between the needles to the front and do 1 purl. You then need to take the yarn to the back of the needles again and knit until you've only got 2 stitches remaining. Then you bring the yarn to the front and do a purl stitch. And finally, you need to slip a stitch purlwise with the yarn in back. So you take the yarn to the back behind the needles again, and you take your right hand needle down through the stitch as if to purl, but instead of purling, you just slip it off the needle. And that's row number 1. For row number 2, which is a wrong side row, you need to begin with 2 purl stitches. Then you need to take the yarn to the back and knit 1. And then you just purl until you've only got 2 stitches remaining on the left hand needle. Then the yarn goes to the back and you knit 1. And finally you slip a stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. So you bring the working yarn to the front, and then you just take the right hand needle down through the next stitch as if to purl, and then you just slip it off the needle. And that's row number 2. For rows 3 and 4, you then just repeat those 2 rows. So you just do rows 1 and 2 again. Then row number 5 is a cable row. So this is where we begin to do the cable stitches. We begin with 2 knit stitches. And then purl a stitch. We then need to do the cable stitches, and we're going to do a 6/6 RC, which is a 6/6 right cross. So take your cable needle and slip 6 stitches purlwise onto the short side, like so. Then, because it's a right cross, we need to leave the cable needle at the back. You then need to knit 6 stitches. Just make sure to keep good tension and make sure that those first few stitches aren't too loose. Then you need to slide the 6 stitches on the cable needle to the end of the long side of the needle. Use the cable needle like a left-hand needle and knit those 6 stitches off. Then you can put that cable needle to one side. Next, you need to knit 7 stitches. Then purl 1. And finally, slip a stitch purlwise with the yarn in back. So make sure that the working yarn is at the back. Then slip the next stitch as if to purl. And that's row number 5. For rows 6 through 12, we're simply repeating rows 1 and 2. So we do row 2 and then row 1, and we do this 3 times. And then we finish by repeating row 2 again. And then we're on to row number 13, which is another cable row. We begin with 2 knit stitches. Then we do a purl stitch, and then 6 knit stitches. We then need to do a 6/6 LC, which is a 6/6 left cross. To do this, we slip 6 stitches purlwise onto the short end of the cable needle. Because it's a left cross, we then leave the cable needle at the front. We then knit 6 stitches. Slide all of the stitches to the long end of the cable needle, then use the cable needle like you would a left-hand needle and knit all of those 6 stitches off. Then knit 1, purl 1, and slip a stitch purlwise with the yarn in back. So the yarn goes to the back of the needles and you slip a stitch purlwise. Then for rows 14 through to 16, you just repeat row 2, row 1 and then row 2 again. And that's it, that's a 16 row pattern repeat. You then just need to repeat from row 1 all the way through to 16 and keep doing that until the scarf is as long as you want it to be. I personally knitted the repeat 6 times and also repeated rows 1 and 2 one last time to finish. If you're wondering why I've got a stitch marker in my work, that was just to keep track of how many repeats I'm doing. It's very likely that during this project you're going to have to change to a new ball of yarn, so I'm just going to do a quick demo of that. The best way to do it is to wait until you're just about to start a new row. Make sure the yarn tail of the old yarn is at least 8 inches. Then make a loop or a hook shape in the end of the new yarn, making sure that the tail of this hook shape is at least 8 inches long and is positioned away from you. Then you begin knitting the next row as usual by taking the right hand needle into the first stitch. But instead of using the old working yarn, you use the loop of new yarn. So pick up the loop with the tail away from you and use that to knit. Be sure to drop the new yarn tail and continue knitting using the new working yarn. The first few stitches will be a bit loose, so just be aware of that and try to keep good tension. I find it best to tie the old yarn tail and the new yarn tail together using a slip knot. And this will enable you to tighten those first few stitches, which are bound to be a bit loose. And then you just carry on knitting the pattern. My finished scarf measured about 7 inches wide and about 28 inches long. When you've made the scarf as long as you want it to be, it's then time to bind off. I'm just going to use the regular knit bind off method. However, when you're binding off cables, it is a little bit different to normal. Now, cables are made by twisting stitches over other stitches, and as a result they have a high stitch gauge. What this means is that cables have more stitches per inch than normal knitting. Therefore, if we bound off by knitting all of the stitches, even the ones that are folded underneath in the cable, we would end up with a finished edge that flares out. And obviously we don't want that, so we need to include some decreases. The type of decrease I'm going to use is the K2 tog, or the knit 2 together. And normally you need to do one decrease for every 2 or 3 cable stitches. This particular cable is 18 stitches wide, so we can either do 9 decreases or 6 decreases in total. I chose to do 9. The first 3 and the last 3 stitches on the needle are just regular stitches. They're not cable stitches, and therefore we can bind them off as normal. So to begin binding off, I'm going to do 2 knit stitches. Then use the tip of your needle to lift up the lower stitch on the right hand needle, take it over the upper stitch on the right hand needle, and then off the needle completely. So you've now bound off 1 stitch. We then do another knit stitch and then bind off. We're then going to repeat doing the K2 tog decrease and then a bind off over and over 9 times. So we knit 2 together and then bind off. Then knit 2 together and bind off. And we repeat that 7 more times, and that will bring us to the end of the cable stitches. And then we just need to bind off the last 3 stitches as normal. So knit 1 and bind off, knit 1 and bind off, and knit 1 and bind off, and that will leave you with just 1 stitch on the needle. The best thing to do now is to leave a very long yarn tail, which you can then use to attach the short ends of the scarf together. So I would recommend leaving a yarn tail that was about 6 times the width of your scarf. Then take this yarn tail through the last stitch and tighten. I would then recommend wet blocking your scarf. Wet blocking basically involves soaking your knitting in some lukewarm water, removing excess water, then pinning it onto some foam mats or a towel and leaving it to dry. You want to pin the scarf into the final shape that you want it to be. So you want to pin it to have straight sides and to lay flat and even. Basically, blocking will make sure that your scarf isn't all bunched up and will have nice even stitches. It's not 100% vital to do, but it's definitely recommended. If you want to learn more about this subject, then I have a video all about it. The next step is to weave in the yarn tails. The idea of weaving in is to secure all the ends of the yarn and also to blend them in to the back of your knitting. You'll want to weave in all the yarn tails except for that last one, which was the particularly long one, because that one we're going to need in the next step. So simply feed a yarn tail into a large plastic yarn needle and try and follow the path of the yarn within the knitting. Keep going until all the yarn tails are secure. Right, so the next step is to join the short edges of the knitting together to form a circle scarf. Normally, when we join knitted edges together, they're nice and flat and even. However, in this case, we're going to be joining cabled knitting together, which is fairly unusual. The complication arises because cabling bunches up the stitches, and as you can see here, it causes the knitting to fold over on itself. This means that at some points on the edge, it's 3 layers thick, and all of these layers need to be involved in the joining process. You'll be able to see that the short edges of the knitting, when they're not being stretched out and they're just lying there naturally, are about the same width as each other. So we're essentially going to treat the 3 layers of knitting where the cable is as one single layer. The first thing I decided to do was use some knitting markers to join the edges together temporarily, just to keep them nicely lined up during the process. Hopefully you've got a long yarn tail leaving one of the short edges, and this is what you're going to use to join the edges together. Joining these edges together will create a ridge, and I decided that I wanted this ridge on the outside of the scarf rather than on the inside. This was mainly from a comfort perspective, but also I thought it might be quite nice to have a sort of separation between the ends of the cable. After all, the cable is not going to perfectly line up. I'm just saying this because you can decide to do this joining method on the outside or on the inside of the scarf. It depends what you prefer. But for my method, I made sure that the outside of the scarf was facing me. If we look a bit closer at the knitting, you'll see that the right hand edge is made up of V-shaped stitches. So you'll see the V-shapes made up of 2 lines of yarn. And then next to those edges are mainly V-shapes on their sides, which is what we're going to be using to join the edges together. So first, bring the yarn up through the corner opposite where the yarn tail is attached. Then go down through the stitch above, and come up through the center of the second V stitch from the bottom edge. Don't worry about being overly precise with this, just make sure that you're working with the stitches next to the edges of the knitting. Then go down through the V-shaped stitch above that, then straight across to the opposite edge, and come up through the stitch directly opposite. Then repeat again, so go down through the center of the stitch above, then straight across and up through the stitch directly opposite. Then we get to the cable section, so now there are V-shapes to go through on each side. So go down through the V-shaped stitch above, cross to the other side, and come up through the V-shaped stitch opposite. Then go down through the V-shaped stitch above, then up through the V-shape on the opposite edge, and so on. It's important that as you're joining these edges together, you keep checking that the edges are still lining up. That way you can make adjustments as you go along. When you reach a section of the cable where the knitting is folded over on itself, just treat this edge the same as you would the rest of the cable. So treat it the same as you would treat a single layer of knitting. So when your needle passes through the edge, it passes through 3 layers rather than 1. Once you've finished, take out the markers. In order to finish joining the edges together, Make sure you take the needle through both corners of the knitting. Then take the yarn from front to back. The last step is just weaving this yarn tail into the back of the knitting. And that's it, you've now finished your scarf. I really hope you've enjoyed this project and thank you very much for watching.